This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief over at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 151 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the NumberFire Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. As you probably noticed, there wasn't a podcast last week, but I promise it was for a good reason. Last Monday at 8:45 p.m., my daughter Avery entered the world weighing a solid 7 pounds 5 ounces. So yeah, I wasn't going to record my podcast while my wife was in labor. Instead, I'm recording it on an hour and a half of sleep. Since we're in August now, I'm going to be moving past the strategy side of things and focus more on player evaluation and fantasy football. If you want to know how I'm attacking the tight end position this year or how I'm approaching Superflex leagues, I've done podcasts on those topics. I've done podcasts on a lot of strategy-related topics. If you want some of that in your ears, you can hit pause on this one and scroll through previous late round podcast episodes. But we're moving on. We're going to talk more about player evaluation. So with that in mind, today we're going to run through some players who I see are undervalued in fantasy football right now, or I guess you could say players that I'm targeting in fantasy football drafts. I wrote an article on these guys over on NumberFire a week or so ago, but I'll try to add some context to that article and throw in a couple of other players that I didn't mention in that piece. So let's dig in. When I went through and thought about the 10 players I wanted to feature in my article for you guys to target in fantasy drafts, I didn't just want to pick late round guys. That's sort of cheating. I wanted a nice mix of early, mid, and late round picks. And from an early round standpoint, one player I chose to feature was Julio Jones, the man who scored a grand total of 3 touchdowns last season on 148 targets. And one of those touchdowns came from the arm of Mohamed Sanu, a wide receiver, and not his quarterback, Matt Ryan. So why target Julio Jones here in 2018? Well, if you've heard me talk on this podcast ever, you know that I'm a believer in variance and, more specifically, touchdown variance. Jones has never been this crazy touchdown scorer, but he's never seen a season like last year ever before either. Based on Julio's yardage total last year, we would have expected him to score 8.66 touchdowns. What I mean by this is that since 2011, a wide receiver with 1,444 yards should have scored close to 9 times based on the average yardage to touchdown rate. Julio Jones scored just 3, which was a near 6 touchdown difference. That was also the second largest difference that we've seen over this time, so since 2011. The largest came from Calvin Johnson in 2012, where he scored 5 times on 1,964 receiving yards. In the following year, just so you guys are aware, Megatron scored 12 times in 14 games. Because touchdown variance happens. And it's not like Jones wasn't used close to the end zone last year. It's not like Matt Ryan refused to target Julio Jones in the red zone. He saw the 3rd most red zone targets of his career in 2017, and he had the 2nd most targets that he's ever seen from within the opponent's 10-yard line. This was an outlier season from a touchdown standpoint for Julio Jones, for anyone really. Jones has hit 1,400 yards in each of his last 4 seasons, and even while missing some time, he hasn't dropped below a 24% target share. It's not that I think DeAndre Hopkins and Odell Beckham shouldn't be drafted ahead of Julio Jones. I just think there shouldn't be as significant of a gap between the two players and Jones as we're seeing in drafts right now. Julio should be absolutely fine this year, and that's especially true now that the holdout never happened. Another early round wide receiver I'm into this season is Doug Baldwin. Now take this recommendation with a grain of salt. Baldwin evidently has a knee issue and he could miss the entire preseason, though Pete Carroll doesn't seem afraid of his status for the regular season. So if Baldwin's average draft position doesn't shift at all with this news, I'm buying him a lot less than I was before the news. But let's look at Baldwin's situation. Over the last 4 years, he's seen between a 20.9% and a 22.05% target share in each season. Some years saw a bit more targets than others because the Seahawks have consistently thrown the ball more as each year has passed, but Baldwin has seen a consistent share of Russell Wilson's throws. Now, of course, the Seahawks have done things this offseason that have let us know that they want to stop going in this pass-friendly direction. They took Rashad Penny in the first round of the draft, and they hired Brian Schottenheimer to be offensive coordinator, who's been a run-heavy coordinator in the past. And even Pete Carroll has talked about having the run game be the focus of the offense. But here's the thing, guys. Teams can try to be as run-heavy as they want, but it doesn't always work. You need positive game scripts in order to focus your energy on the run, and you also need an offensive line. The Seahawks are entering 2018 with one of the worst lines in football, albeit probably not as bad as some make it out to be. And as my man Chris Raybon tweeted a couple of weeks ago, they're also favored in just 3 of their first 15 games this season. So do they want to run the ball? Sure, they want to run the ball. The question is, can they run the ball? And I'm not as optimistic as the Seahawks seem to be. But on top of this, there's reason to believe Doug Baldwin's typical 20 to 22% share will increase this year as well, as long as he is healthy. Paul Richardson and Jimmy Graham are both gone, and they accounted for 31% of the Seahawks' targets last year. Their replacements can and will take on some of that work, but their replacements are also objectively not as good, especially at tight end. So with Baldwin, you're looking at a situation where his target share should almost certainly rise this year, and while that may not matter a whole lot if we assume the Seahawks become more run-heavy, I think becoming more run-heavy is a lot easier said than done. I talked about Matthew Stafford a few weeks ago when talking about players with favorable early season schedules, and that's really why he's one player that I'm targeting in fantasy football drafts this year. Just to reiterate some of that information, Stafford and the Lions open up the season against a decent Jets secondary, but a beatable one considering they'll be at home as pretty big favorites. Stafford against the Jets is a fine start. Then the Lions will face the 49ers, Patriots, Cowboys, and Packers. None of those secondaries are projected to be top secondaries this year, and some of those contests could also be pretty high scoring given the opposing offenses that the Lions are facing. I'm someone who streams quarterbacks, as I'm sure a lot of you are too. Stafford's consistently been a low-end QB1 over the last few years, but the real reason that you want to target him this season is because he could be a top 5 guy after the first 5 or so weeks of the season. It's really nice to get a late-round quarterback who you may be able to set and forget during the biggest waiver wire period of the year. Next on this list is Rex Burkhead. Now, I wrote this article and chose these players to target before news broke that Sony Michel is going to have a procedure on his knee, but that also just makes Rex Burkhead more valuable. Let's just assume for argument purposes that Sony Michel will be ready for week 1. A lot of people hate the Patriots' backfield because it can be unpredictable week to week, but New England is consistently producing fantasy points at the running back position. They ranked 2nd in points scored last year at the position, 6th in 2016, and 4th in 2015. Right now on fantasyfootballcalculator.com, Sony Michel is being drafted at RB25 while Rex Burkhead is at RB32. That's changed a bit since I originally wrote my article, but the gap is enough where Burkhead still seems like a strong target. Even if Burkhead's ADP rises a bit with this Michel news, he's still a worthwhile target. If you recall, Burkhead got hurt in a Week 15 game against Pittsburgh last year, and he was on the injury report until the Super Bowl. Before that Week 15 game, we had a 5-game sample after New England's bye of Burkhead playing with Dion Lewis. And I'm pinpointing New England's bye here because that's around the time that they decided to stop using Mike Gillislee. During that 5-game stretch, Burkhead played more snaps than Dion Lewis, he saw 9 more targets, and he had 5 more goal line attempts than Dion Lewis had. And that was while seeing just 14 fewer carries. Burkhead actually scored over 4 more PPR points per game than Dion Lewis did during this 5-game stretch. You may be thinking though, well, what if Sony Michel has a bigger role than Dion Lewis had? And he might, but he also might not. And at the very least, it sounds like Burkhead could end up being the goal line back in an offense that we know is going to score points. To me, Rex Burkhead is a slam dunk pick in the middle of fantasy drafts. And that Sony Michel injury just makes him a more obvious selection. The least confident player to target that I'm going to be talking about today is Sammy Watkins. I think Watkins has a really wide range of outcomes, but I also think that he's well worth a selection where he's currently being drafted, which is around Michael Crabtree and Will Fuller around wide receiver 30 on fantasyfootballcalculator.com. I do think Watkins is a good match for Pat Mahomes in that his average depth of target has been higher than 13 in each of his 4 seasons in the league. And we know that Pat Mahomes has a big arm. Just for some perspective, Antonio Brown has hit that high of an ADOT just once across his entire career. But we shouldn't just assume that Mahomes is going to do what Alex Smith did last year with the deep ball. That's really weird to say, but Smith was an absolute machine throwing the ball deep last year. Half of his touchdowns were on 15-plus air yard tosses, and none of those touchdowns happened in the red zone, which means half of Alex Smith's touchdowns came outside the red zone last year. The average percentage of touchdowns coming from the red zone among 200-plus attempt quarterbacks last year was about 66%, so far higher than Alex Smith's. What that means is we're going to see a slightly different way of scoring in Kansas City this season. It's not going to just come from these long ball tosses. I mean, it might, but math is telling us that there will be some regression. And that's where I think Sammy Watkins can thrive. Last year, Tyreek Hill had just 4 red zone targets. That's the same as Russell Shepard among many other very mediocre players. And every single one of Tyreek Hill's touchdowns were 30 or more yards. Meanwhile, Watkins was targeted 10 times in the red zone last year with LA, and he scored 7 times. He actually had the highest red zone touchdown total on the Rams, despite seeing only 13.5% of the team's targets. We don't know exactly how things will be distributed in Kansas City this year, but I don't think that we should be shocked if Sammy Watkins just straight up out-targets Tyreek Hill. That's why there's just so much potential here. But even if Watkins doesn't see more volume than Hill, he does appear to have more touchdown potential, which will go a long way in fantasy football. I talked about George Kittle in my tight end strategy podcast as someone that I'm targeting this year, so let's dig into why. I think you're making a mistake if you're simply looking at Kittle's usage last year and just equating it to how Jimmy Garoppolo may target him this season. Last year, he saw just 10.8% of the team's targets when Jimmy G took over, but he was also a rookie tight end, and rookie tight ends don't produce. Only 8 first-year tight ends have caught 50 or more passes, and Kittle himself had an 8.17 yards per target rate last year, which ranked 15th all-time among rookie tight ends with 20 or more catches. An opportunity should hypothetically be there for him in 2018. The 49ers don't have a stud receiver stealing 25 to 30% of the team's targets, so there is target share upside. And you're also associating your tight end with a really good offense when you draft George Kittle. The 49ers with Jimmy G ranked first in yards per drive, scores per drive, and 10th in touchdowns per drive last year. You have to tell a story a bit with Kittle becoming more involved in that offense, but he was a pretty good rookie tight end when you give his season context. There's not locked-in competition for looks in San Francisco, and the 49ers offense should be good. All of that combined means that I really like Kittle as a later round tight end target. It feels like Randall Cobb always has something going on health-wise, and that's no different at the start of camp this year. Even still, he's another player I'm absolutely targeting in fantasy drafts this year as long as he can get things settled down with his health. Cobb hasn't really been relevant for almost 4 years. He ranked 29th in points per game fantasy scoring back in 2015, 44th in 2016, and 38th last year. That's all at the wide receiver position. That's definitely not something to write home about. But there are some reasons for the poor output. In 2015, for instance, Aaron Rodgers just wasn't himself. He threw to the lowest yards per attempt rate of his entire career. That was the season that Jordy Nelson was sidelined and the Packers had zero alternative outside threat, which limited their offense. Cobb's situation wasn't really typical that year, but to be fair, he still finished as a solid wide receiver 3 in fantasy. Then in 2016, Cobb just couldn't stay healthy. He played 13 games and he was on the injury report 6 separate weeks with a hamstring and ankle injury. And then we know what happened last year. Aaron Rodgers was out. The thing is, though, last year when Rodgers was healthy, Randall Cobb was kind of sweet. He averaged 14.5 fantasy points per game in the 5 games with Rodgers, including 9 targets per contest and over 60 yards per game. Without Rodgers, he averaged 8.4 PPR points per game. So you're looking at high-end wide receiver 2 numbers with Aaron Rodgers versus fairly replaceable production without Aaron Rodgers. And not only was Cobb perfectly viable with a healthy Rodgers last year, but this season, Jordy Nelson is gone. Nelson has seen at least 22% of Green Bay's targets in each of his last 3 healthy seasons with Aaron Rodgers, which will free up volume in that offense even with the addition of Jimmy Graham. And this time around without Jordy Nelson, they do have a legit outside threat in Davante Adams. Now, I understand the concerns with Randall Cobb. He's got question marks with his health, and maybe you're a little worried about his touchdown scoring ability with Jimmy Graham in the mix now. But he's being drafted as the wide receiver 34 on Fantasy Football Calculator, and that may drop now due to his current injury. Given the opportunity cost at that point in the draft, which is not very significant, I'll buy the injury risk in an offense led by Aaron Rodgers. The Colts backfield could be tricky to dissect this year. You've got Marlon Mack, who's probably the favorite to lead the backfield in touches, and then the Colts drafted Nyheim Hines and Jordan Wilkins in rounds 4 and 5 of the NFL draft. The player that intrigues me most in that backfield is Nyheim Hines. I liked him a lot coming out because he's a super versatile back who can play all over the field. Hines really does fit the mold of a pass-catching back that's needed in today's NFL, and he's very athletic. But the situation itself makes Hines really interesting too. As I said, he's going to be competing for touches with Marlon Mack and Jordan Wilkins, but Mack ranks second worst in percentage of runs that went for 0 or fewer yards last year, while Wilkins doesn't have a ton of experience being a bell cow runner. Now, it's not that Nyheim Hines does, but you're not drafting Hines to just be this early down bruiser. You're drafting him because he can be a Chris Thompson-like piece in the Colts offense. And considering the Colts currently have no locked-in wide receiver 2, that could end up being a big deal. I mean, across the Colts roster right now, you've got T.Y. Hilton, Jack Doyle, and Eric Ebron as the only established pass catchers. Hilton's never seen a target share higher than 26.5% in an Andrew Luck-led offense, and Luck has never targeted the tight end position on more than 26% of his passes in a single season. So to put this another way, half of Indianapolis's targets this year are going to unknown commodities, whether that be Ryan Grant, Deion Kane, Chester Rogers, or the running backs that I just talked about in the backfield. So Hines should be able to steal some touches on the ground in what should be a committee in Indianapolis, but he's got a lot of PPR potential given what he showed at NC State and what the Colts' current depth chart looks like. I think the biggest value in fantasy drafts right now might be Emmanuel Sanders. He's being selected in the wide receiver 32 range, which is kind of crazy when you consider that he's averaged 8.57 targets per game over the last 4 seasons. Now, Denver drafted a pair of wide receivers this year in Deshaun Hamilton and Courtland Sutton, but in 2018, they're still going to feature Manny Sanders and Demaryius Thomas. And they've also got what should be an upgrade at quarterback in Case Keenum. It's not that I think Case Keenum is a stud, I just think it's pretty easy to make the argument that Case Keenum is a lot better than the trio of Trevor Siemian, Brock Osweiler, and Paxton Lynch. I mean, those 3 guys remind me of the diaper that I changed at 3 a.m. this morning. It sounds as though both Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders are going to play in the slot this year a little bit more than what we've seen in the past. And that's an important place for Keenum because Minnesota tallied the 8th most yards to the slot last year according to Pro Football Focus. That's a huge reason for Adam Thielen's big season. And I expect Sanders to beat out Thomas in slot snaps this year. He lined up on almost 28% of his snaps last year in the slot, while Thomas was in the slot on 18% of his. In 2016, Sanders was in the slot on 24% of his snaps, while Demaryius Thomas was there on 21% of his. So with Sanders, you've got someone who's bound to see decent volume. He has a quarterback upgrade, and he should play more in the area of the field where that quarterback seems to target. I'm going to be drafting a lot of Emmanuel Sanders this season. The last player featured in the Players to Target article was Cam Meredith, who's looking to play the slot in New Orleans this season. If Meredith didn't have the injury question marks, I'd be completely all in. But I also think his ADP would be higher if he didn't have those question marks. According to PFF, the player who ran the most routes from the slot last year for New Orleans was Brandon Coleman, who's yet to exceed 500 yards receiving in a single season in the NFL. Brandon Coleman isn't very good, and he was actually released by the Saints over the weekend. But even with Coleman leading the team in slot snaps, New Orleans still ranked 11th in slot receiver yards last season and 17th in slot receiver targets. Given their run-friendly offense, that's not bad at all. But Meredith, in his one productive NFL season, ran 52% of his routes from the slot. That's likely where he's going to line up in this New Orleans offense. And I want a piece of that. Willie Snead played that role 2 years ago when he saw over 15% of the Saints' targets, and he ranked as fantasy's 31st best receiver while playing 15 games. And even though the Saints are more run-heavy than they were 2 years ago, as I've talked about on this podcast before, things should lean more towards the pass this year than it did last year for the Saints. Even if they keep up a similar pass-to-rush ratio, which I don't think they necessarily will, but even if they do, the Saints had the same number of passing touchdowns last year as rushing ones. Since 2011, we've seen 17 NFL offenses finish a season with as many rushing scores as passing scores, with 4 of those happening last year. So of the 13 instances with next season data, the average increase in ratio was 1.3. So if we attribute that to New Orleans, we'd expect New Orleans to go from a 1.0 passing to rushing touchdown ratio last year to one this year that's 2.3. It just goes to show that there's some variance that goes into how teams score touchdowns. And guys, it's not like Drew Brees is all of a sudden bad. He actually had the 4th highest adjusted net yards per attempt of his career last year. I want pieces of this Saints passing game. And if those pieces are cheap, then that's absolutely fantastic. Right now, assuming Cam Meredith is healthy, you're looking at a slot receiver in a highly efficient offense that should see some positive regression, dropping off of draft boards in the double-digit rounds. I'll take that all day long. Now, like I said at the top, I want to talk through a couple of more players quickly in order to give you loyal listeners a little bit more than what I provided in my article. I like providing context to the things I write on this podcast, but you guys deserve more. So I'm going to very, very briefly touch on some players who just missed the cut that I wanted to write about. One of those players was potentially going to be Rashard Matthews, but his injury has completely scared me off. So instead, I think Taywan Taylor is a really good late round selection this year. He fits a lot of the criteria that I outlined in my spotting a breakout wide receiver analysis, and he's super cheap in drafts. And my prospect model liked him a lot coming out last year. So I'm into Taywan Taylor late. I'm also into Matt Breida. I remember talking about this on the podcast a couple of months ago, but not only could Breida have a role in that San Francisco offense, but what happens if Jerick McKinnon isn't what the 49ers think he could be? There should be some work for Matt Breida, but he also has the upside to have a larger role if Jerick McKinnon just doesn't work out. This is not a handcuff situation because you're not drafting Matt Breida in case of a McKinnon injury. You're drafting Breida because there's at least some ambiguity in front of him in a very strong offense. He could have flex appeal even without a Jerick McKinnon injury. And then 3 more late round wide receivers I think are worth targeting are Anthony Miller, who should see work right away in that Bears offense, Kenny Stills, who continues to fly under the radar despite negative Devontae Parker reports in Miami, and I am warming up a lot to the potential of Tyler Lockett given Doug Baldwin's injury. Hopefully that gives you guys some idea as to where my head's at and what I'm thinking. To be honest though, pinpointing players I like in fantasy drafts is less important than looking at players that I don't like. As some of you already know, my draft philosophy largely is about being open to drafting lots of players and focusing on just a handful that you just feel aren't worth the cost. And that's what I'll be looking at next week, players to avoid in your fantasy football drafts. Before I let you go today, though, a reminder that if you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it on iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, TuneIn, and Stitcher. I'm also on Twitter @LateRoundQB. If you have any questions for this week's mailbag show, you can hit me up on there or email me at jj@numberfire.com. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.